This is a live look at the only open border crossing between Syria and Lebanon right here. And earlier we were seeing groups of people walking through the streets as though in celebration. The Syrian government has collapsed, falling to a rebel offensive that seized control of the capital of Damascus, has sent crowds into the street to celebrate the end of the Assad family's 50 years of iron rule. Syrian state television airing a video statement this morning by a group of men saying that President Assad had been overthrown and all prisoners had been set free. Now, just moments ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sharing a statement on the Syrian government collapse. We dipped into it. He was speaking in Hebrew. However, he then shifted to English, and I did want to play that out for you right now. Let's listen in.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its suppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. Equally, we send a hand of peace to all those beyond our border in Syria, to the Druze, to the Kurds, to the Christians, and to the Muslims who want to live in peace with Israel. We're going to follow events very carefully. If we can establish neighborly relations and a peaceful relations with the new forces emerging in Syria, that's our desire. But if we do not, we'll do whatever it takes to defend the state of Israel and the border of Israel.
So that was the very latest from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And earlier this morning, this is a social media post by the Israel Defense Forces saying, in accordance with the situational assessment following the recent events in Syria, including the entry of armed personnel into the buffer zone, the IDF has deployed forces in the buffer zone and in several other places necessary for its defense to ensure the safety of the communities of the Golan Heights and the citizens of Israel. We emphasize that the IDF is not interfering with the internal events in Syria. The IDF will continue to operate as long as necessary in order to preserve the buffer zone and defend Israel and its civilians. Also sharing just moments ago some new video that we are going to work to turn around, talking about in the accordance with the understanding between Israel and Lebanon, IDF troops are currently operating in southern Lebanon to prevent Hezbollah from deploying and to remove threats. And they were sharing some video of anti-tank rockets, mortars, grenades, and a vehicle equipped with a rocket launcher that were located and then dismantled, as well as several underground tunnel shafts. To talk more on this, I do want to bring in the Director of Foreign Policy with JINSA, Jonathan Ruhe. And Jonathan, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we are continuing to follow the breaking news out of Syria, the collapse of the government, ending President Assad's and his family's 50-year regime. We were listening to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking about the impact. Syria borders a number of these countries, including Lebanon, where Hezbollah is located. What is the impact to Israel when it comes to the collapse of the Syrian government?
So, I think in terms of what it means for Israel's relationship with Hezbollah and the sustainability of their ceasefire, I think it's sort of an unexpected blessing from Israel's perspective and America's as well, because one of the biggest impediments to upholding the ceasefire was going to be preventing Hezbollah from being resupplied and rebuilt via Syria. Syria was a linchpin of what Iran called its land bridge across the Middle East, which enabled it to deploy forces and, more importantly, weaponry to Hezbollah across the Syria-Lebanon border. And so I think that is the sort of the biggest windfall, at least immediately, from the Israeli and American perspective, is that will make Hezbollah's reconstitution much, much, much more difficult. We know they have the intent to try to rebuild, as we saw already in just the days and weeks following the implementation of the ceasefire formally. But now I think that equation changes significantly.
And I also wanted to bring this social media post up again, Jonathan. The Israeli Defense Forces talking about assessing the offense in Syria and then deploying forces in the buffer zone and in several other places necessary for its defense, saying that they are not going to interfere at all with the internal events in Syria. But what does this mean when it comes to deploying forces in the buffer zone and several other places? What are they possibly anticipating?
So I think they're anticipating that anything is possible. Since October 7th, Israel's calculus and its risk acceptance have changed profoundly in terms of letting potential or real threats build up on their immediate borders. I mean, Israelis are still dealing with the tens of thousands of evacuated civilians from their north who fled after October 7th because they thought Hezbollah was going to launch a similar offensive to what Hamas did in the south. I think that is still very much front of mind for a lot of Israelis, even though there's not necessarily as clear or as present a danger on the Syrian side of Israel's border. I think this is a preventive measure, which, as we heard from the Prime Minister, is temporary, much like I think officially now their continued presence on the ground in southern Lebanon is temporary and contingent upon events there. So I see a very similar outlook for the Israelis in the Syrian side of their border, guarding against anything and everything that could arise. Obviously, what's happening now in Syria is a bunch of different forces filling a vacuum, and everything is unpredictable. Anything could happen. I think the Israelis are hoping that a pound of or an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in that sense.
And I also wanted to bring in this live look for our viewers. This is the only opening at the border between Lebanon and Syria. And you were just mentioning that Israel likely sees the collapse of the Syrian government as a blessing because Syria was helping to supply Hezbollah, and Iran, all of these interconnected. When we talk about the closings of most of the borders and this one remaining, does that help Israel because that really prevents any sort of exchange from happening?
I certainly think it's a net plus from the Israeli perspective. Certainly, Hezbollah built a lot of infrastructure underneath the Lebanon-Syria border precisely because they figured that would make it harder for Israel to interdict a lot of the key weapons supplies that were coming from Iran via Syria into Lebanon. So I think right now, considering that Israel de facto controls Iran's ability to resupply Hezbollah via air and ports, so we saw them turn around an ostensibly civilian airliner last week that was bringing in an airlift of military supplies for Hezbollah in violation of the ceasefire. I think from Israel's short-term perspective, again, this is all part of a larger, unexpected flow of benefits from the precipitous collapse of the Assad regime. I would say one more thing that maybe people aren't tracking closely enough or as much is the collapse of Russia's position in Syria potentially as well. Not just their naval bases, but what we're already seeing is the relocation and potentially dismantlement of their advanced S-400 air defenses in Syria, which, while they've never fired on Israel in hostility, certainly have posed a potential hindrance to Israeli air operations over Syria. So that may be another blessing that the IDF realizes in the short term.
And Jonathan, I wanted to share this social media post with our viewers, this coming in from the Prime Minister of Israel. Quote, "If we can establish neighborly relations and peaceful relations with the new forces emerging in Syria, that's our desire. But if we do not, we will do whatever it takes to defend the state of Israel and the border of Israel. So I did want to talk to you about that because you were just mentioning the fact that there's almost a vacuum and these different groups are trying to fill that void. You know, what might that look like? Because, of course, I imagine it would greatly impact Israel depending on who then takes control.
Yeah, I think there's a whole kaleidoscope of potential actors who could fill that vacuum or parts of it, as we saw with the Syrian civil war a decade ago, when the regime was on the ropes. From Israel's perspective, looking out from the Golan Heights into Syria, you could see towns that were controlled by Hezbollah right across from towns that were controlled by ISIS. And while those two groups were busy fighting each other, they equally had expressed their overriding hostility to Israel, and the victory of either one of them would then immediately become a strategic problem from Israel's perspective. I think right now the situation is obviously very fluid, but while we're also seeing several different rebel groups or anti-Assad groups that are each moving in different parts of Syria to try to fill the vacuum, I think the main leading group, HTS, has at least tried to officially rebrand as a more moderate and less externally threatening actor that has an internal purpose, both to try to unify and provide a big tent for Syrian opposition groups, but also to avoid what we saw happen in the last decade with Syria's previous civil war, which is the weakness internally in Syria tends to invite a lot of external intervention. And so I think right now, what we're seeing, the main leading actors inside Syria who have overthrown the Assad regime, it appears, certainly try to avoid recreating that dynamic from 10 years ago and assuaging the outside world's concerns, in this case, foremost Israel's, that they need not intervene in what's going on in Syria right now.
We're just talking about external intervention, and I think top of mind when we're thinking about Israel and the number of conflicts that it's currently in right now, Iran. Where does Iran fit into all of this?
Well, I think amazingly, not really anywhere at the moment. I think the only thing that's been as surprising as the speed of the Assad regime's collapse is the fact that Iran really hasn't lifted a finger to try to save one of its most important clients, especially after losing Hezbollah, well, not losing Hezbollah entirely, losing most of Hezbollah's capabilities and leadership that made them so useful to Iran. They've also, in a similar sense, lost most of their most important capabilities in terms of Hamas in Gaza, even though the group is still persisting at some low level. So I think right now, the main concern is not that Iran or its other proxies will intervene massively in Syria. I think now, if you're Iran, you've lost a lot of these key assets from around the region in your so-called axis of resistance. You've also lost a lot of your ballistic missile production capability due to Israel's airstrikes in October. So I think if you're Iran right now, what's most worrying from an American and Israeli perspective is you've lost all these other great capabilities. So your nuclear program is really your ace up your sleeve now, threatening to expand that program and even to build the bomb itself, which is a big change in Iranian rhetoric. That's your best hope for deterrence and regaining escalation dominance like the Iranians felt they had over Israel for much of the past year.
Jonathan, before we let you go, is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers as we continue to keep a very close eye on all of the developments from this breaking news?
I would just build on my last point, which is everyone certainly with good reason focused on what's going on the ground in Syria. But just this past week, Iran announced a massive expansion of its uranium enrichment program, which serves the purpose I just mentioned of trying to restore its image of strength that's been so badly damaged in recent months and weeks and even now days. But it's also a negotiating gambit with the expectation that when President Trump takes office next month, he will try to re-engage in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. And I would just say to the incoming administration and to the current Biden administration, it behooves both of you as commanders in chief to begin having a strategy to deal with this now, because Iran certainly thinks that time and momentum are on its side on the nuclear front in a way they clearly don't on the regional front.
All right, Jonathan, as always, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
My pleasure. Thank you.